It's certainly true that we approach our past by thinking in ways different than people in the past thought about it. So every generation brings to an understanding new ways of thinking, and as a result of that, generations in the past perceived what occurred to them or what occurred to their parents or grandparents in one way. We today might look at it totally differently. And that kind of presentism or ahistoricism can be extremely problematic. It might cause us to act in ways that is short-sighted in the long run. I think studies have shown that it's important that people understand that they have a past, that they come out of a tradition, that there's a story that accompanies how they got to where they are today, and that they need to learn that and have an appreciation for it. That doesn't mean that you perpetuate or celebrate or embrace the difficult aspects of the past, but it certainly means that you have an understanding of it and that you recognize the inequalities or injustices, or perhaps, as you put it, the imperfect nature of our past. And so by coming to grips with that past as best we can today, then we can act on it in ways to prepare us for a brighter future. The idea of a usable past is something that is popular among public historians. And indeed, I think all of us feel that we can learn from the past. Indeed, there's a popular phrase, if you don't know your past, you're bound to repeat it. And so a lot of people think that it's simply a matter of understanding the past as a usable past so that we can act on the future. And there's truth to that, certainly. I think some folks get carried away with the notion of how they interpret the past, and they allow that to kind of control their actions. Or perhaps they interpret things in a way to justify their behavior, almost as if the end justifies the means, right? So you've got the process of perhaps being a little ambiguous or vague about the past, or even misleading about the past as a way to get towards a particular conclusion. And as a historian, I find that problematic, and I think students find it difficult too. If you don't teach historical evidence and as accurate, if you don't use the past in a fashion that is accurate, then you run the risk of compromising your integrity, and by compromising your integrity, bringing into question everything you're trying to accomplish. So therefore, my concern with a usable past is that we don't allow inaccuracies to cloud or dramatic stories or perhaps sensational events to get in the way of telling the truth. We need to be truthful when we talk about the past, at least as best we understand it and can explain it. As a student of the American South, I quickly came to understand that there really is no black history or white history, because the study of the American South is a study of not only black and white people, but Native Americans and Asians and Latinos and everybody who's come to this area and made it home or have been here in one way or another to contribute to that larger story. And consequently, when I started reading and studying the past, it was a process of breaking down that kind of binary that others had constructed. For the longest time, it's true that white elites would write their story and their understanding of what transpired that tended to feature their own lives and histories. It's understandable. It's what everyone does. They write about themselves. Historians, however, try to approach the past with a greater understanding of. They're not writing it necessarily about themselves. They're writing it about the other people that they're trying to understand and learn from. So, as a result of that, the notion of a separate black history or a white history is antithetical to understanding how the two came together and lived together, and as a result made the history together. I study civil rights, and the civil rights movement is not black history, although there might be some who would argue that this is African American history. They may, in their way, compartmentalize it or set it aside as a kind of black history. But the truth is, the civil rights movement involved black and white people. You can't understand the movement without understanding the involvement of both. And consequently, to be able to tell the story, you have to engage both. And so from that end, it's always been, for me, a story of everybody who's here, and everyone engaged in struggle or fight or conflict. I think human beings have always tried to understand why they're here, the purpose of life, and the meaning of life. And in the course of doing that, they create ways of remembering the past around key events, around individuals that they respect and admire. And in doing so, they create memorial sites somewhere to be able to gather and pause and reflect about that heritage, about that past. With civil rights, the push to memorialize that past was really driven initially by the actual participants, the individuals who were involved in telling that story. In some ways, of course, there's a human aspect of simply trying to gain immortality by trying to guarantee that demonstration, that past, that involvement would never be forgotten, and that whatever gains might have been accomplished from the protest would forever be secure. Eternity's a long time. And yet we know from the pyramids and the Sphinx that human beings have been doing it for trying to memorialize this past for a long time. And so one can only hope that civil rights memorials, which have been constructed as a way to express a kind of tolerance in America, not just gaining equal rights for African Americans, but also ending discrimination against women, people based on their national origin or their religion, their sexual orientation, or because of some disability. Instead, saying that everyone in America deserved equal treatment and therefore tolerating everyone regardless. And those memorials today express that kind of vision, that desire, that goal, that ideology in our country. If you were a teacher who was fortunate enough to be able to have the resources to take a classroom of students to visit a civil rights sites, by all means, I would encourage you to go. A visit to a site where history takes place is one of the best things in the world you can do to help bring that history alive to students. And most of the major sites associated with the modern civil rights movement in America, the era from 1954 to 68, have been interpreted as civil rights memorials that are designed for students to visit. It could be a site where you actually pay to tour a museum that has been constructed that tells the story of what transpired there within the context of a larger national and international story. If you have the money to pay the gate receipt and go in, by all means do. It could be as simple as calling a church that might have been associated with the civil rights demonstrations and arranging to visit the church and see that historic site that might be a place of worship on Sunday, but was actually a site for mobilizing a social revolution on a Monday night during the era of the civil rights struggle. It might be as simple as walking on a street, down a sidewalk to a county courthouse, or leaving a public park to then march towards a store and a lunch counter that discriminated. And in the course of taking students on a march down a city sidewalk to what had been a Woolworths department store that had a lunch counter, you're having your students engage in a kind of reenactment that allows them to relate directly with this past. I can't think of a better way or a better teaching method than taking a student to a site where something actually transpired. When teaching about the Civil Rights Movement, there are wonderful resources available for teachers to use in the classroom. Some of these materials have been packaged by organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center, which provides for teachers for free its pedagogical materials, things like its magazine, Teaching Tolerance, its documentaries, Selma, The Bridge, or A Mighty Times, films on the Montgomery bus boycott. But then there are also online, available through resources like the Digital Archive of Georgia, civil rights films from the actual footage of news broadcasts of the day that can be accessed, showing the demonstrations that took place. Those are wonderful resources to bring into the classroom because it helps bring home the drama of the conflict that was playing out across America's streets as America came to grips with the history of white supremacy and the demand that privileged and that racial privilege in, as African Americans were able to wrestle a seat at the table by opposing that kind of discrimination. There are other documentaries. Eyes on the Prize is a popular film series that was produced. It kind of sketches out the entirety of the civil rights movement in a great fashion that I find very useful. Teachers can also use things like newspapers. There are wonderful accounts in newspapers that are contradictory. So if you want to tease out different ways of looking at the civil rights movement, you could look at such diverse newspapers as the Atlanta Daily World, a black newspaper that would present coverage of a civil rights conflict one way, the Atlanta Constitution and the Atlanta Journal, two white newspapers in Atlanta that tended to tell different stories, one from a conservative perspective, one from a liberal one, and then the New York Times, which would look at the conflict in even a different way. So by pairing 4 different newspaper accounts of, say, a conflict in Birmingham, you can walk away with an interesting contrast to try to get at how did Americans see what was taking place in the streets, and add into that the film coverage that was then broadcast on ABC or NBC. And you really got a great overview of how the journalists were telling the rest of the country what was going on. At the same time, they're phenomenal memoirs and oral histories of the participants who give that present voice of being there at the scene that are great to use in a class with students. I'll simply end by encouraging teachers to try in their classrooms to engage the question of race relations, to do so by pointing to the need for all of us to live together. We have one world, one earth. We are all on it, and we have to all get along. And consequently, it's in the classroom where you can teach people how to get along. I think teachers have been doing a marvelous job over the last decades, inculcating into their materials lesson plans on civil rights, talking to and encouraging their students to understand the need for equality, to teach them that the inequalities of the past, the imperfect past, the ideology of white supremacy that previously existed in our country was so destructive, and that this new vision of a tolerant society is the way forward, not just for Americans, but indeed for the globe, for everyone. And that the place to be able to have those conversations and to begin the process of change is in the classroom. And I firmly believe that it's been through the classroom that students have been embracing that change, and that it is the younger generation of the country today who are at the forefront of guaranteeing that our world will be a better place and that we will address these problems.